Way back in 1974, we lived in Houston, Texas. I was 10 years old. We lived next door to a kind old lady by the name of Mrs. Wheelie. She had a great home. I remember her backyard was filled with fig trees, and how she would allow us to play in her backyard and eat as many figs as we wanted. But I also remember that one day, coming back from school, our mother told us how Mrs. Wheelie had passed away. It was sad because she was nice to us. But for some reason, I would see Mrs. Wheelie 3 more times. A few weeks had passed when Mrs. Wheelie's family had an open house. They were selling all of her property. I remember going over with my mom, and we looked at stuff, and my mom had found this big Bible she fell in love with, which we still have today. But as my mom looked through the pages, I could see someone moving from the corner of my eye, and when I turned around, it was Mrs. Wheelie standing at her bedroom doorway. She was dressed in black, and her gray hair was even more gray, and she had a sad look to her face. I can still hear her sigh, then turn around and walk back into her room. I remember telling my mom, "Look, there's Mrs. Wheelie." But my mom looked at me, giving me a frown, which meant, "Be quiet." That was my first encounter. On my second encounter, a few weeks had gone by. My younger brother and I were playing in the driveway when I noticed that the curtains in Mrs. Willie's house were moving. I knew the house was empty. No one was living in it. As I stood there, I looked, and I could see Mrs. Wheelie looking out the window. I stood there and looked at her as she looked at me. And for some reason, I could tell that she was happy. She didn't have a smile on her face, but I could tell by the look in her eyes. She slowly backed away, and the curtains closed. And that was my second encounter. My third encounter. A few months had passed when my little brother and I were playing in the backyard. All of a sudden, I noticed that the trees in Mrs. Willie's yard were moving, as if there was a wind blowing. But only in her backyard. There, next to the garage, stood Mrs. Wheelie, watching us. I looked over at my little brother, and I could tell that he could see her too. We stood there watching each other for 15 to 20 seconds. And then all of a sudden, she was gone. And after that day, I would not see her again.